there to the present. Brecht is very much a school author. So in about grade 10, I read Mother Courage for the very first time, and it left a deep and profound and lasting impression on me. The loss in war, the notion of suffering, in particular the figure of Katrin, who's someone who sacrifices herself ultimately to save an entire city. So that left a deep impression on me on a personal level. And then in the late 2000s, when I was thinking about my next project, I knew I'd always known for a while that Brecht had adapted Sophocles' Antigone. So I knew there was some kind of link between Brecht and tragedy. So then from a professional point of view, I got drawn into this particular subject. And what then happened very quickly as the project evolved within weeks or so, that I realized that the Brecht's Antigone was only one particularly important and particularly well circumscribed aspect of a much bigger issue, namely Brecht's engagement with tragedy, the tragic tradition and tragic form. This is also why then very early on I had this tripartite structure of the book in mind, which is also what the final product actually then adopts. In the first part of the book, I talk about Brecht's engagement with Sophocles' Antigone, and that's a very interesting hybrid between an adaptation, a translation, and an entirely new play. But then the second part, I try to widen this and position Brecht's relationship with Greek tragedy relative to other classicisms, if you will. So theatrical naturalism, that's the theater of Ibsen or Strindberg, the Asian traditions, Japanese No, for instance, and Kabuki, which were quite important for Brecht, actually. Some aspects of the German classical tradition, and Shakespeare as well. And the final and the third part of the book, I use, and that's the most comparative part of the book, I use elements of the tragic template, if you will, heroism, gender issues, the use of chorality, the use of time and space, closure, the question of justice, spilling of kindred blood, so typical tragic tropes, and I use them to read Brecht's plays as reconfigured tragedies in these comparative explorations. And I do 10 plus plays in this third part, and the conclusion then there is a wrapping up. It's a fairly extensive conclusion. There's a wrapping up of this whole project.
What do you think Brecht reconfigures when, I mean, from the classics, from the Greek tragedies, all that?
You're right. Brecht, you said in your earlier remarks, Brecht very much likes to position himself or to pose as an anti-classicist. He poses as this radical innovator. Once you scratch that surface, and that's one of the main arguments of that book, really, is that this is both right and wrong. Brecht innovates and he's radical, but there's no way of understanding his innovations and his radicalism without understanding his deep indebtedness to the tradition. So he's in that sense completely dialectical. You cannot be innovative without being inspired and working with and working against the tradition. There's no way of understanding and even conceptualizing Brecht's radicalism without understanding his conservatism. So what exactly does he relate to? I discovered in my research that there are essentially two conceptions of tragedy that he's working with and against. One is, if you will, tragedy as a worldview, as a conceptual way of making sense of the world. And then he's using a well-established concept that comes out of German Romanticism to see tragedy as tragedy of fate. And that means things are ordained by the gods. There's nothing we can do about them, and fate just delineates. So standard example would be the go-to interpretation of Sophocles' Oedipus the King, right? He's the oracle, he will kill his father, marry his mother, and things just delineate. And there's nothing you can do, tragedy of fate. And that's a worldview which Brecht emphatically resists. That is completely unacceptable, because the tragedy of man or of human beings are human beings. So that's the one tragedy I found. The other notion of tragedy that Brecht has is a formal one. not a conceptual, but a formal one, if you will, an aesthetic one, and that is tragedy conceived as what he calls the big four. Big means big issues, big language, and so forth. And he innovates, I think, in enormously creative ways with tragedy as the big form. But of course, he finds the big form preconfigured in Sophocles, in Aeschylus, in Euripides, in Shakespeare, and Schiller. So these two conceptions, tragedy as tragedy of fate, as a worldview, and the formal conception of tragedy as the big form. One is something that Brecht works against, fate. The other form, the other conception, the big form is something that tragedy, that Brecht explores and creatively engages with.
Right. So you wouldn't be saying, for instance, that the second thing that he's doing, tragedy as big form, with which he's engaging, is somehow his creation, as it were, but it's something that one could find in the Greek tragedies too, and in Shakespeare too. And would you say that's fair?
Yes and no. Yes and no. For a good example is that is the use of a chorus. As many of you know, the chorus is one of the typical features of a Greek tragedy. Every Greek tragedy, if you do comedy too, has a chorus. Brecht is one of the very few theater artists in the 20th century who also uses choruses, but he uses them in different ways. He will also have people who sing, individuals who sing. So he reintroduces, if you will, music into the tragic form, which is something you see a little bit of in Shakespeare, but you won't see music really in Ibsen or in Schoenberg or Schiller and so forth. So yes and no. He sees certain aspects pre-configured, and then does very much his own thing.
His own thing.
That's right.
I mean, there's a reason I asked that question. I don't know how many in the audience would agree with me, but when I too was introduced to Brecht via Mother Courage, which I think is the usual. But I loved his plays. It seemed like an arbitrary connection he was making between feeling and not thinking, as though somehow if the audience were going to be invested and engrossed in the play, then they wouldn't actually be doing critical thinking, which is what he wanted theater to do. And so I wasn't very I didn't understand the logic of it. It just seemed bringing two arbitrary things together in the level of a sentence. And I've seen productions where people use his methods of alienation and justice and all of that, and yet the audience completely relate to the character, so on and so forth. And people who've not used those theatrical methods and yet have had audience to critical thinking. So it seems to me not very homogenizing like that, the theory. So I wanted to know if, because in that sense, Brecht posits all tragedies and everything from the classical period or even Shakespeare as all being full of feeling,
yes,
and not something that makes thinking possible.
Yes.
And I wasn't very sure of that. And that's the reason I asked you, is it fair to say something? But is it fair to say that it was all Brecht, but if it was actually there in the plays?
Dichotomy that you talk about, that on the one hand there are these engaging plays, and there's a theory which is taken to advocate, if you will, cerebral, disengaged, purely cognitive reception, if you will, or engagement with those plays. That's a very, very widespread misconception of Brechtian theory, which he himself probably did a lot to facilitate. But it is really a misconception. It is a fundamental misunderstanding what he is all about. The two need to go together. In fact, Brecht emphasizes time and time again that theater has to be fun. It has to be enjoyment. For instance, Brecht's ideal notion of an audience member is the person who actually sits back, has a drink, smokes a cigar, the way you would go to a sporting event, for instance. So that's very much the notion he has in mind. Having fun and thinking and learning. Brecht is all about learning. Theater is learning. You need to love learning. You need to have an emotional, affective investment in the act of learning in order to learn properly. Actually, the cognitive and the emotional go together. To illustrate this, perhaps there's a very important theoretical article written by Brecht in the mid-1930s on Verfremdungseffects in Chinese acting. And in that text, he describes the acting of a particular Chinese actor, Mei Lanfang. Demonstrates, he doesn't embody, but he demonstrates Brecht's views. And this is the kind of acting he endorses. Then he uses one German, Durchkältung. And in the standard English translation of this term, that is rendered as cold theater. And this is where these misconceptions of Brecht as cold and cerebral come from. But Durchkältung in German means through colding. That's a literal translation, colding through. And I think the best way to explain this is imagine a Starbucks cup of coffee, piping hot. And you may remember it says on the sleeve, caution, the beverage you're about to enjoy is extremely hot. It's actually piping hot coffee is not fun to drink. It's actually unpalatable. It's just too hot. So I think what Brecht means by Durchkältung, colding through, is you take the cup and it's right, or you just let it sit. You don't drink cold coffee. Cold coffee is not fun, but you let it come to a palatable. It's not piping hot, but a palatable room temperature. And I think that's what this whole theory is about. The problem about, let's say, naturalism is that in naturalist playwriting, you are completely drawn into the events. You are, as Brecht would say, hypnotized. You are bawling your eyes out as you see suffering happen. You're completely incapacitated. That's not fun. It's not fun for actors. It's not fun for audiences to be weeping in a theater. What he wants is not old, distant observer, but he wants to have someone who actually can even enjoy watching suffering, can even enjoy watching tragedy. The palatably, comfortably hot theatrical experience. So you can actually taste the aroma of nicely, palatably warm coffee.
Yet also, I mean, well, it wouldn't work with the coffee example, but with theater, yet also think about it.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, you mentioned Mother Courage earlier. Perhaps a good way, and Georgie, perhaps if you look at the slide, Silent Scream 1, that might be a good anchor actually to illustrate this, what I have in mind. This is a scene in Mother Courage. For those of you who don't know this particular play, Mother Courage is set in the 30 Years' War in Europe, in Central Europe, in the 17th century. It takes place, we follow the path of Mother Courage for 12 years. She's a merchant. She has a cart and sells her stuff to the army. So she profits from vending this stuff to the military. She has 3 children, young adult children, 2 boys and 1 girl who is physically disabled. She's not able to speak. Of this magnificent, I agree with you. I think Mother Courage is one of the best plays, frankly, ever written. In the course of the war, we see her lose all 3 children, 2 soldiers, and in this, Catherine, the daughter, ultimately self-sacrifices in order to rescue and warn an entire city and to save it from destruction. Scene in the Silent Scream, Mother Courage on the right-hand side, she just heard off stage how her second son, Swiss Cheese, has been executed. It happens off stage. For reasons I can't get into, she's not able to show this because by speaking up and being affiliated with her son at this particular point of the play, she would put herself and her remaining family, in particular her daughter, at this point, and the person she's with right now, he's a priest in disguise, she would effectively jeopardize their chances of survival. So she has to remain silent in order to survive. At the same time, she's a mother who has just lost her child as we speak. She hears her son being executed. Now what happens here, and this is, I think, one of these fantastic moments in Brecht, Brecht scripted this scene differently. Brecht in the play in the stage directions, in various versions, always just wanted her to sit here, and then the lights would go out, and there would come, so black hole, right? There's this black hole of nihilistic nothingness, right? The light comes on, and there she still sits. Helene Weigel, this is his wife in the role of Mother Courage. She, in the course of the performance, she's also a mother and so forth, she feels, I can't do this. This is beyond my actor capacity and my human capacity. I have to do something as an actress. And what she started to do, and Georgie, there's also a second slide, Silent Scream 2, which gives you this this is a few seconds later, so the other person has left. There's just her, and she just uses her body, and she screams without uttering a sound against the scripted play of her director, husband, playwright, Brecht. And I think she just gives an articulation to this intrinsic tension here between. Brecht sees her ultimately as responsible for her son's death. She profits from the war. She is one of the enablers of war. She's a perpetrator of war. At the same time, that may well be true. At the same time, you and I and every audience of Mother Courage ever has felt she's also a victim of this war. I mean, there's a way in which she's deeply and profoundly innocent. And we have to give expression to her humanity. And I think that Silent Scream expresses this quite marvelously. And again, Brecht has almost scripted the scene so well that it almost resists any kind of detached, cerebral, lights out, lights on kind of reading. You have to invest that with emotion. And again, we're not losing, I think, anything in terms of learning or enjoyment and whatever. It's just a profoundly engaging moment of theatre.
Yeah, I enjoyed this moment in the book too, because it seemed to me that moment where you could see that Brecht could not control this, I mean, either the script or how he wanted the audience to react, or even how he wanted the actors to play it, that the theatrical act would go beyond him, but that would not preclude any of the effects that he wanted to portray in doing so. I want to briefly take a detour to the Antigone. You say in the book that he's a very good micro reader of the text. I want to know what you mean by that, and especially in relation to the Antigone example.
Yes, micro reader, Brecht reads texts very carefully. One thing that I should say, I'm a classicist, I'm a trained philologist, Greek, Latin, and so forth. So I'm trained to read texts very carefully. And when I started to work on this project, I realized very quickly that Brecht too is a very careful reader, and he's a very good crafter of words. There's a huge amount of real craftsmanship. And I have to tell you, Vighnesh, over the time that I worked on this book, my admiration for Brecht as a formal artist who does things with language, who does things with gesture, props, and the very fine, meticulous work that is really a craftsman of the theatre. Once you look at the text more carefully, you'll see that he very regularly works incredibly effectively with language. In the Antigone, for instance, he uses an existing German translation by the Romantic playwright Friedrich Hölderlin, who translated Sophocles into German. It's a very idiosyncratic translation, which in particular follows Greek word order very closely. And Greek word order is very free, unlike, say, English word order or German word order. So it sounds distinctly different. And that's precisely what attracted Brecht actually to Hölderlin's language. That's for feminine too. It's unusual. It's not something. And then there are a number of instances in Brecht's working with the translation where he then tweaks Hölderlin's German in such effective and small words, in small ways, that again you see the micro reading very nicely. Other things, micro reading, if you interpret reading also more broadly, not just as reading text, but also, let's say, as reading action and performance, what you notice very quickly is that Brecht is very careful about meticulous things about staging. Perhaps, Georgie, at this point, if you could put up the slide cover, this is the cover of the book. And on this cover, I have a color photograph of Brecht staging of the Antigone. I should also say one of the, I think, objectively speaking, differentiators of the book is that the book contains the first ever publication of 38 color photographs of Brecht's Antigone. It's the only Brecht in color that exists. I found those at the Brecht archive. I was lucky enough to get the copyright. It's never ever been published before. The other thing that's never ever been published before are Brecht's handwritten inserts into his personal copy of Aristotle's Poetics. They've only been in the Brecht archive since 2007. No one had looked at them. So there's actually completely original new archival material. But just to come back to the staging right here, you can already see there are these poles. You can't perhaps quite see this on the screen, but on top of these poles, these are actual horse skulls. They got actual horse skulls.
Real horse skulls.
Boiled them down to the skull, put them up there. And that's Brecht's visual rendering, if you will, of saying you're witnessing a Greek tragedy, but this is really barbaric theater. This is a theater of sacrifice, sacrifices all around. So this is, if you will, Brecht's version of the Greek column.
Right.
So this is not a nice Doric temple kind of column, but he has, if you will, exposed it for what it really is, barbaric theater. This is a theater of needless sacrifice, of course, because they are human beings who lose their lives when they shouldn't, because they are in these tragic situation. That's something that needs to be resisted. But you see here also a very careful attention to props, to staging. I can't go, you see these masks here these are the masks that the chorus will put on and so forth. So micro reading, Brecht is also very much a very detailed craftsman of the stage. Contemporaries of Brecht, even when they didn't like him personally or didn't like his playwriting, whatever, one thing people invariably admired is Brecht's directorial work and his detailed work with actors and with the stage. So that too is another instance of micro-reading, creative, always original, and very often against the grain in really interesting and engaging ways.
And so this would also be an example of him moving towards that tragedy as big form, trying to show the unfairness in the situation, even if it's not so explicit in the text. With his staging, he makes it explicit.
That's a new big form that he creates there. So he's working with, let's say, the chorus in their masks. And you can see the masks, and these are primitive masks. They are masks that are literally, that's Brecht's version of the Greek mask, reconceptualized within the big form,
right?
If you will, yes.
Well, I have a question related to big form, but also related to something in the end of your book, which is you say, what do we do with the Western tradition of tragedy that we have? And you suggest that we should be Brechtian readers, not just to tragedy, but to Brecht too, in the sense of being utilitarian, taking what works and not rejecting what doesn't work. So I wanted to ask you, what do you think does not work in the Greek tragedy and the constellation of works there, and Brechtian theatre and its theories for the contemporary moment, not just in terms of theatre and staging, but also in terms of tragedy as a concept and as a political concept. So I just want you to comment on this in a set of ideas.
One thing that really doesn't work and where we really need to move beyond Brecht is his entire focus on class at the expense of gender and race. I do think Brecht is not, it has to be said, Brecht is not particularly, although he has fantastic female figures, but he's not particularly aware of the manifold problems of gender. There's much more actually in Greek tragedies that you can do, but Brecht is not particularly. He has a very still a very patriarchal, I believe, a very kind of bipolar and binary conception of gender, and he is completely oblivious of questions to do with race and social justice. And again, that's definitely something where I think Brecht's work, perhaps not necessarily Mother Courage, but other places like The Good Person of Szechuan, for instance, which is about a woman who has to dress up as a man and completely embody a man in order to survive. I think there's huge potential actually to utilize Brecht and re-script Brecht in order to explore things to do with race, gender, so forth. So there's definitely one area where Brecht doesn't quite work. I think the other area where I'm not sure whether Brecht doesn't work, but I think where many of us have problems is, of course, Brecht's political commitment ultimately to a Marxist worldview, this notion of class conflict that ultimately will be overcome. And I think, now about 75 years after Brecht's death, after the demise of communism and so forth, we've seen that perhaps this particular model of socialism, Marxism in this particular way didn't quite work, and we need to be more critical of that. At the same time, I think something that and I also say this for the Rhodes Scholar community, I think that's something that people like you and me and all of us can really take away from Brecht. Brecht has a profound underlying optimism. There is ultimately, and that's I think what makes his notion of the tragic really distinct. There's always, yes, humans are the tragedy of humans, and it's the tragedies that we are dealing with, social injustice and so forth, are human-made, and therefore they need to be fixed and can be fixed by humans. But ultimately, there's always a silver lining on the horizon for Brecht. It may be displaced onto the audience or something. There's a profoundly rooted optimism. And I think, especially in the early 21st century, there's a great deal of indifference, jadedness. We just put up with things. Another school shooting in Texas right now. We're just tragic events, and tragic in this case means done about it. We just and that's something he resists. This kind of tragedy is unacceptable, and it has to introduce in us and stimulate in us big anger, lasting anger, and the willingness and the ability to change. Also, the patience. Change is not something that will go and come about quickly, but the readiness to change. And I think particularly for the Rhodes community, I think that's a fundamental value we need to subscribe to, that we have this enormous privilege of being part of this community. It is part of our obligation, our moral obligation actually, to try to keep on working despite all these, and even if we may not have the patience. People might say climate change, one of the big issues of our time. We don't even have the time for patience. I can see that argument. But we need to be optimistic, constructive, productive, and try to work towards these better goals. I think that's definitely, again, even if we may not follow Brecht in kind of the ideological frameworks that he was using, I think this general sense of productive, constructive optimism, I think is something that we can really take away from.
So to see or to reuse the word tragic, not in the sense of, well, how sad it is and then just let it go, but to think of it as to go beyond and register the structural forces that are responsible for
exactly. The first reaction is, this is unacceptable. It's just unacceptable that we're ruining our planet. Racism is unacceptable. School shootings, gun violence, unacceptable. Anger, but also then the productive engagement to do something about this in my own micro world, and then in the other worlds that I may have access to. And then collectively, Brecht often also in his poetry, he uses the metaphor of the stone and water. And water over time remolds and reshapes the stone. It takes time, but that doesn't mean it's futile at all.
Thank you. This was, this was a great conversation for me, and I think it is time to open up the conversation to our audience, and if they have any questions to you, then they could ask on the chat that we could take up. Until we have questions, I do have several other questions about it, so I could just go on and on. One of them was, you talk, you dedicate an entire chapter in the book to comedy, except you're thinking of comedy not as the other of tragedy, but in conjunction with tragedy, and I wanted you to say a few words about that.
Yes, one thing I noticed when I went to the place is that there's not a single Brechtian play that doesn't have some kind of humor in it. Even in the Antigone, there is a particular myth that he actually invents at one point. So that's actually quite laughable. And I think I discovered then very quickly that this is also part of Brecht's conception of the tragic, that there can be no seriousness also without lightness, and there can be no lightness without seriousness. Brecht talks about this. He actually gets this idea out of Asian philosophy, that the tragic is inconceivable and the sad is inconceivable without the lightness and the and many people actually, there's a quite famous saying by Charlie Chaplin that is tragedy kind of at a distance of this kind of thing.
Completely. I mean, comedy just becomes a different mode there.
That's right.
To do the same thing that you said we should do, right? To register what kind of forces are creating an awful situation for different people.
That's right. And here too, he responds to something that is in the Greek tradition. The Greek tradition does have a fairly rigid distinction between tragodia, tragedy, and komodia. Comedy, different costumes, different styles of the chorus, different language, and so forth. There are some comic elements in some tragedies, arguably, and they're definitely tragic or parodic elements of tragedy in comedies, but they're more pronounced. The differences are more pronounced. What Brecht is able to do is, again, to show in one artifact that one cannot exist without the other. Again, it takes me back to this question of cold through and the palatable hot coffee. Humor and lightness is also one way to make the coffee palatably warm. They just sit a bit, and to let us enjoy theatre, even if we watch horrible things unfold on stage. So let us sit back and enjoy and have fun, and be entertained.
I mean, I have one question about this palatability, and then I think we have an audience question, which is, and I thought about this even when you were saying, I understand this palatable in theatre and not too hot, but that's not how, for instance, you cannot say, give me a palatable tragedy in life. Life's not going to do that to you. So if we are thinking about the world and the stage in a sort of dialectic way, is this palatability actually harmful? Because you can't be drinking coffee and having a cigar and sit back and...
Fantastic question. I think this is where art comes in. I think, if you say tragedy in life is unbearably hot. There were however many children, it's unbearable. In the Brechtian conception, makes that somehow bearable. It makes it bearable. It makes it something that you can actually sit through. For the techniques that Brecht uses to make it bearable is, for instance, to have commentary, to introduce an audience already at the beginning of the scene. This is what will happen. Again, to have this occasional laughter and this kind of juxtaposition, montage, and so on. And in Brecht's conception, of the tragic, it's needed, and that's where art comes in, because art is for him the easiest mode of existence. And art, it's actually one of the functions of art, to make the suffering bearable. Because only if we're able to sit through it for 2 hours can we actually learn suffering, if we are just so unbearably taken in by what has happened, we are incapacitated to action. We need art, as you will, as a buffer to make it bearable, but also to make it, if you will, actionable.
Right.
To make it something that we feel, well, now I have a distance. I see this is what happened in Texas. So this is climate or whatever. I can see this is just the tip of the iceberg. And there are systemic things that are going on. There are roots for this, and that they may not even, strictly speaking, have to do with guns. They have to do with other things. And only once we have the distance and even the joy and the engagement that art is able to provide, are we able to see and therefore tackle and learn about the systematic things that underlie these unbearable tragedies.
Right, so you're saying that tragedy on stage is not going to be like that. There's a reason that it's not going to be a tragedy in life, because, there are a set of things that he wants to do.
Yes.
Right, got it. So we have a question. Where do you see theatre practitioners benefiting most from your work, both actors and directors? So not
thank you.
readers,
thank you very much for this extremely important question. One thing I should say, my academic position is a position in classics and theatre studies. So every semester I work with actors and in training and directors in training. And one thing that I tell them and they tell me is enormously helpful for them, particularly in the North American context. More or less all directors and actors are being taught in some kind of Stanislavski-inspired method acting thing. And method acting, I should say, is very much about embodying. Think, pretend you are Hamlet, be Hamlet, be Ophelia. And as any actor will tell you, being Ophelia or being Hamlet for 3 weeks, 6 weeks, 7 weeks is not just difficult, it may also be enormously unhealthy. So I think one thing, in answer to this question, I think one thing where actors and directors can really profit from Brechtian theatre techniques, including actually Brechtian acting training techniques, is establishing this kind of healthy distance. In Brechtian acting, you do not embody, you show. You show Hamlet. You show Ophelia. To give you one example, Georgie, if we could perhaps quickly come back to this slide, the cover with the staging of the Antigone. I can give you a concrete example of this actor training techniques. Perhaps so you see the circle formed by these poles. The inner circle, and then you see an outer circle with the actors. And by the way, this is during rehearsal. There's Brecht and his wife, Helene Weigel, sitting on those benches in the outer circle. And one of the rehearsal techniques that Brecht used in the rehearsal process was to have the actors. So by the way, all the actors looking on all the time, but then an actor like the Antigone would stand up shortly before she comes on. And then she says what Brecht called bridge verses. And in a bridge verse, the actor would say, and now Antigone went in order to take up dusk and bury her brother. And then she's in the inner circle and plays the part. So this is, if you will, where the actor doesn't embody, but she shows. Now I stand up from the bench as a performer, and now I'm telling myself, Antigone went, picked up the jar, picked up dust, and buried her brother. So she's not saying, I am Antigone. She's saying, I'm showing what Antigone did. Third person, in the past. So that's a typically Brechtian acting technique in order to ingrain in the actor, you are not Antigone. You show Antigone. So observe, even as you're playing her, observe her. So I think that's something, I think actually for actors' mental health, but also, of course, the other big plus of this kind of technique is that once again, you have this distance, you are not Ophelia, but you show Antigone or Ophelia or Hamlet, you're able to mold, you're able to do something to that character because you have a certain distance to that. And I want to emphasize this gesture, and I can fix that. So you can almost, if you will, correct and changed almost from the outside as you're working on this. And the other question was from a director's perspective. I think very similar things here apply as well. Use, if you will, the creative distance and the cocoons that are there in order to position, arrange, montage, juxtaposition. It gives you much more sense of control, of power, and ultimately a sense of purpose. It's a follow-up question from this person or another person on that particular. This may even be, of course, a practitioner, right, or someone. Yeah. So I'd be very interested.
I mean, I had a follow-up to that question, which was, I mean, what would that do to tragedy? Because this is not just about learning from Brecht's techniques, but what would be its relation to tragedy and the tragic? Because I'm also thinking of it, doesn't it require, I mean, sometimes too much emphasis on this kind of alienation and or reading out the script and the stage direction before coming on stage doesn't invest me as an audience member at all in the play, and therefore I'm not even incited to, you know, do the thinking that would ensue from it. So I'm, and in, for instance, a silent scream, it doesn't seem like that kind of thing is happening there at all. There, it seems to me that the actor is very much, well, acting out the character.
I agree. I do think the silent scream is a significant exception that proves the rule. I think that's really, that is, I agree with you. And that is a point where this kind of approach breaks down. I would agree with you. Because I think that this is just where it collapses. There's just a point reached in the silent scream where this kind of distance is no longer possible for the performer. And I agree with you, not for the audience either. If you see this, this particular production is available on film. If you see this, it really is extraordinary. I agree with you. I think it's not. I still think it's a very useful technique, but like all training tools, it has its limits. And I think the silent scream is quite definitely a moment where this tool loses validity.
Yeah, and it's also very critical. So that's there to silent screams the term. We have another question. Agreed about the general principles of Brechtian acting, but I was wondering, so this is a follow-up too. If there were specific insights which you have had that might be less familiar and in relation, and that would be in relation to this comparative work that you've done.
Yes. One thing, I mean, and this also connects to the actorial dimension, also to your question, what's actually not good about Brecht. I talked earlier about Brecht's blind spots when it comes to gender. One thing was actually at my home institution when the theatre program, they did another Brecht play, The Caucasian Chalk Circle. And there is a court scene at the end of that play where there is quite clearly, there's a misogynistic remark by Brecht. Essentially, there is there's a rape in front of them. And essentially the argument is it's the woman's own fault, this kind of thing. So what happened? Unacceptable. So there are various, what do you do with that kind of thing as a director and as an actor in the early 21st century? You could edit it out. What they did, and I love that solution, they played the scene and then they had the actress step out of the role and comment on that and say, essentially to Brecht, this is unacceptable. I, as a performer and as a woman, what the scene as you scripted this, I cannot do this. And I protest. And so here, for the record, this is not right. And this is one of the examples where I feel this is ultimately a Brechtian technique, and it's a commentary. It's kind of an internal audience. And that for me was an eye-opener. I really quite like that, taking issue with kind of beating Brecht with his own weapons and turning those weapons against that playwriting itself. So this would be, I think, one of the ways where I felt, in this case, through my experience, not necessarily as a researcher, but in this case as an audience member, I'm learning from theatre practitioners that I found very illuminating, where Brechtian techniques, in this case of commentary and an internal audience, can be used, critically of Brecht's work himself. So turning the tables on Brecht, because that's of course what Brecht did to Shakespeare, to Sophocles, and to all the others. So if he did it to them, we should be more than to do this to him.
Well, I wanted to take that a bit to Greek, because this is also about the Greek tragedy, to take it to Brecht's own reading of Greek tragedy, in that take from him to be good critical readers and read against his readings of Greek tragedies, because it seems to me, and you do say it at different points in the book, that he has quite a homogenizing view of the Greek tragedies that does not take into consideration the kind of different affiliations that the different plays have, their contexts, and they're all not tragedies of fate. And in fact, at some point you say tragedy of fate isn't even entirely a Greek concept. So
yes,
would you comment on that?
Yes, this concept of tragedy of fate originates ultimately from German Romanticism, and it then was perpetuated in the German school system in the 19th century, that's where it's coming from. Its kind of key witness is always Sophocles' Oedipus the King, right? Again, there's the oracle, and then it kind of delineates. And it may or may not work for this play, but once you actually widen your focus even beyond that, even in the antiquity, it's, I think, very, very hard to argue fate into this. Like Euripides' Medea, where a woman ends up killing her own children. This is about impossible choices. There are also other tragedies. One Greek tragedy we should be talking about in this context is Aeschylus' Oresteia, and that's actually a connection of three tragedies. And this is a sequence of three plays which ultimately actually has a happy ending, where then in a court of justice, the spilling of kindred blood is being adjudicated, and the conflict is ultimately actually resolved. So you might say this is almost possibly anti-tragic. There's no black hole to fall into, but there's actually a constructive, institutionalized legal system that is able to heal a wound. And the Oresteia in particular has been used in the 20th century and 21st century to apply to other societal wounds. For instance, there's an adaptation of Aeschylus' Oresteia for the South African context called Molora by the Canadian playwright Yael Faber. And there she uses the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission to feature as this kind of justice tribunal that is there ultimately to, yes, acknowledge the crime, but also to find ways to move on and to find ways of carving out a path for the future that is reminiscent of the hurtful past, doesn't bury it, but also enables us to live on together and to live on peacefully together. And again, there are lots of other routes where you might take this model and so forth. So this has proved entirely productive. So there's so much more, and there's so much more interesting stuff. And people, fortunately, both scholars and theatre practitioners have seen for a long time now that there's so much more to Greek tragedy than an extraordinary reductionist and simplifying and often blatantly wrong conception of Greek tragedy as tragedy.
I mean, I just want to add to that in relation to Oresteia. If one goes a step ahead as a kind of Brechtian reading, one could see it not just as a shift from, which is of course how it's commonly seen, as a shift from retributive justice to the establishment of court, but also even in that staging, how some people are excluded from it. For instance, Clytemnestra, in the end, what happens to the Furies who are representing her is that they're actually not heard. And Athena comes in the end and says, I'm my father's child, and therefore disregards Clytemnestra's claim to Iphigenia's sacrifice and acquits the son and establishes the court. One could say that about the Commission too, for instance. I mean,
yes.
So so the play is not just a celebration of these justice systems, but it could also stage how these systems, to a certain extent, definitely helped, but also had several exclusions and did not have in their infrastructure to listen to certain voices.
Yes, that's definitely one reading of the ending of Aristotle. The other reading of the ending of the Aristotle, and I should just tell for the audience, at the end of this play, so the Furies have been the ones who were eager to avenge the spilling of kindred blood, in particular the killing of a mother in this particular play. At the end of the play, of this trilogy, these Furies are then redressed. Actually, they become from the Furies, the Erinyes, they become the kind ones, the Eumenides, and they get a cult, and they get different costumes and so forth. So there's the sense of, if you will, integrating into cult and into the city and into the community the Furies of old, the things that have bothered us for so long. The Furies make it very clear, and Athena makes it very clear, they can still turn against us. So, if you will, the ghosts that have haunted us could potentially still come back. I think that's the other reading of the ending of the Oresteia. We need to give them cult, we need to acknowledge them, and we need to be aware that they are there, and we have to keep the memory of the wound fresh, if you will, and active, while at the same time we have to keep working on it. Reconciliation is not a done deal. Reconciliation is work in progress, real collective societal work in progress.
Yeah, well, actually, I think that has larger resonance to the outside theatre too. So I think that is a good note to end on if we do not have any more questions from the audience.
No more questions. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for hosting.
No, it was really great to have you. I hope that we will see some of you at our next event next month on June the 22nd with Chisanga Chekwe. But thank you both once again for being here and in the same room. That's been amazing as well.
Wonderful.
Thank you all for joining us and see you soon.